y'all, it's me again. I'm going to continue reading from my book, The 1910s. Let's go! Government by the people. If one examines the historical course of progressive politics, one finds that the progressive movement began in the city, spread rapidly to the states, and reached the federal level most effectively in its later phases. Indeed, if one looks at the history of American cities, one is impressed with the fact that their progressivism was really well underway in the 1890s when the city governments of New York, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, and others were reformed. By 1895, over 70 citizens organizations had been formed to work for the improvement of city condition. But in law, the cities were simply the creations of the states. In efforts to better municipal life, forced reformers time and again to confront the power of the allies of local bosses who sat in the state legislatures. Moreover, many of the business abuses, from extortionate railroad rates to the exploitation of women and child labor, were by their nature susceptible to reform only on the state level through statewide laws. Around the turn of the century, several of the reform leaders were elected state governors. Among the first of these was Robert M. La Follette, who was elected governor of Wisconsin in 1900 and who waged a courageous and markedly successful battle to regulate the railroads and public utilities of his state and tighten its tax system. Similar battles were fought in California by Huron Johnson, in New York by Charles Evans Hughes, who had previously done notable work in exposing the corrupt practices of insurance companies. In Missouri by Joseph Folk, in Oregon by William S. Uren, and still later in New York, Jersey by Woodrow Wilson, and in Ohio by James M. Cox. In their struggles against railroad, utilities, insurance companies, and other business organizations, reformers were driven to do constant battle with the political machines fed by contributions from businessmen. They became convinced that in order to achieve lasting success, control of the political parties and the state and local governments must be taken out of the hands of venal bosses and put into the hands of the people. To this end, they proposed and succeeded in getting passed in many states democratic reforms of varying degrees of effectiveness. Corrupt practices acts were intended to attack the illicit relations between money and politics. The direct primary was intended to put the choice of political candidates in the hands of the people, rather than the party machines, and thus raise the level of political leadership. The initiative made it possible for citizens organizations to propose legislation, while the referendum made it possible for voters to pass on state laws. The short ballot was adopted to make it easier for the voter to perform its function intelligently. The recall of public officials was widely adopted by means of removing corrupt or incompetent officials before the expiration of their terms of office. Finally, since many reform measures were being turned down by courts throughout the country, more advanced reforms began to advocate. Even the public recall of judges in 7 western states actually made provision for such recall. This proposal, which seemed to threaten the independence of the judiciary, was particularly shocking to conservatives. Though the controversy aroused was meaningless, since to judge of any superior or supreme court More advanced reforms began to advocate. Even the public recall judges in several western states actually made provision for such recall. This proposal, which seemed to threaten the independence of the judiciary, was particularly shocking to conservatives, though the controversy aroused was meaningless, since to judge any superior or supreme court of any of the states having such laws was ever recalled. When Theodore Roosevelt attempted to arrive at a compromise on the issue suggested the recall of judicial decisions in 1912, he lost many of his Republican friends. The demand for returning government to the people was carried from state government into national affairs. In the House of Representatives, insurgents under the leadership of John Clark of Missouri and George W. Norris of Nebraska struck a blow at Buzium when they took away from Uncle Joe Cannon, the Speaker, the power to control the workings of his Vital Rules Committee. The Senate itself, which had long been stigmatized as a millionaire's club and a haunt of reactionary allies of big business, was at last touched by the reform movement when the 17th Amendment took the power to appoint senators out of the hands of the legislators and required direct election by the people. On a national scale, certain national problems, especially those involving big business, railroads, tariffs, financial capital, and the like, were too large to be dealt with effectively in the states. At the turn of the century, it was already clear that the demand for reform would reach national political leaders. When the conservative McKinley was assassinated in 1901, his replacement by a representative of the new generation, Theodore Roosevelt, only released forces that were already in existence. Roosevelt himself was a combination of moderate conservative and moderate progressive. He did not believe that trust busting on a large scale was practicable or desirable, and who looked with some anxiety upon the discontent stirred up by the muckrakers and other reformers. But he was also opposed to plutocratic arrogance, corruption, civic indifference, and materialism, and he understood the need of right-thinking Americans to be reassured about the ability of the government to cope with bosses, bankers, and trusts. Although he did not act on a large scale against trust, his prosecution of the Northern Securities Company, one of the biggest and best known, established the point, as he said, that the most powerful men in this country were held to accountability under the law. Again, his settlement of the honest strike of 1902 in the face of arrogance and stringent conduct by the mine owners confirmed the impression that the country at last had a president big enough to stand up to the great capitalist interests. During Roosevelt's administration, Congress also set the basis for effective railroad regulation by passing the Hepburn Act, which, though it failed to satisfy the demands of ardent reformers like La Follette, gave the Interstate Commerce Commission enough power to begin the substantial reduction of many rates. Congress responded to public pressures aroused by such muckrakers as Upton Sinclair and Samuel Hopkins Adams by enacting a Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. A reform about which Roosevelt did have unbounded enthusiasm was the conservation of natural resources which had been squandered for generations. Roosevelt set aside millions of acres of timber and other lands as governmental reserves, put the zealous conservationist Gifford Pinchot in charge of the natural forests, and in 1907 called a national conference of governors and others interested in conservation, which elevated the concern for conservation to a national movement. Under William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's chosen successor, progressivism seemed to be marking time, so far as the federal government was concerned. It was true that Taft pushed antitrust activities far more vigorously than Roosevelt and extended some conservation policies, but he failed ignominiously to win rail tariff reform, an issue Roosevelt had entirely ducked, and his acceptance of the leadership of Senate conservatives offended progressives. Increasingly, the insurgents within his own party struck off on their own. On a few issues, they were successful. Not only did they break the power of Uncle Joe Cannon in the House, but they strengthened the power of the ICC with the Mann-Elkins Act and passed a Fiscal Evaluation Act, alongside by La Follette, which set up a more realistic framework for railroad regulation based on the true value of railroad property rather than on water stock. They also pushed through, with some support for Taft, the 16th Amendment authorizing an income tax which was ratified in 1913, and the 17th Amendment providing for popular election of senators was ratified the same year. Taft's inability to command the loyalty of progressives in his own party led to a Republican split, manifested introduced in 1910, and finally in the formation of a new, though short-lived party, the Progressive Party, whose 1912 platform may be taken almost as a confirmatory statement of the social aims of the progressive movement. The split in the Republican Party between the followers of Theodore Roosevelt and those of Taft was a welcome opportunity to the Democrats who had not elected a president since Cleveland in 1892. The forces of Western and Southern Arianism were still strong in the Democratic Party, and Democratic progressivism was somewhat more colored than that of the Republicans by old rural animosities. Like the Progressive Party, the Democratic Party endorsed a wide variety of reform proposals, but many Democrats considered Roosevelt's acceptance of bigness in business as a betrayal of what they felt to be the central goal in the progressive movement, the restoration of a truly competitive business world. Woodrow Wilson's campaign speeches were a masterly restatement of this view. He argued that no government would be strong enough to regulate the interests satisfactorily as they were not broken up through antitrust action and the restoration of competition. In this way, the main argument between the two progressive-minded candidates in 1912 became an argument between regulated monopoly and regulated competition. Wilson's presidency. Backed by widespread progressive sentiment in both parties, the Wilson administration set out vigorously to redeem its promises of business and tariff reform. In 1913, responding to an appeal by Wilson for real tariff reform, Congress passed the Underwood Tariff, the first satisfactory downward revision since the Civil War. Its passage was probably made possible by an unprecedented act on Wilson's part, a bold appeal to the American public against the activities of business lobbyists, activities of the sort which had crippled all previous attempts at tariff revision. Banking and credit reforms followed. With the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, the United States devised, for the first time in its long history of unsatisfactory banking, a sound central banking system with adequate governmental direction to make sure that farm credit facilities are accurate. Congress also passed the Federal Farm Loan Act in 1916, which enabled farmers to secure loans against farmlands and buildings, and the Warehouse Act, which made loans available against stored farm products. To meet the demand for antitrust legislation, the administration secured the passage of two laws in 1914. The first, the Federal Trade Commission Act, was intended to prevent unfair trade practices by creating a commission empowered to investigate corporations to issue cease and desist orders when it found that such practices prevailed. Wilson's own appointees to this body, however, proved relatively lax, and in later years the commission was frequently used as a way of encouraging business consolidation. The second law, the Claim Act, was intended to expand the legal foundation for antitrust action laid in the Sherman Act of 1890. A notable provision demanded by AFL head Samuel Gompers seemed to exempt labor unions from prosecution as conspiracies and restraint of trade, but later decisions by the court nullified its force. Since the Clay Act was passed just on the eve of World War I, however, it came into being just at a time when, in the interest of wartime production, antitrust activities were largely suspended. Progressivism's legacy. The progressive movement was dependent upon the civic alertness and the competitive mood of a great part of the alertness of the public. Such a mood cannot last forever. Perhaps what was most remarkable about the progressives was their ability to sustain reformist enthusiasm as long as they did. Even the First World War, which in the end helped to destroy the progressive movement, was conducted with true progressive fervor and under the cover of progressive thinking. For the war too became a crusade against upper class, an attempt to make the world safe for democracy. When the reaction finally did come, it was sharp and decisive. The war left people fatigued with Wilsonian idealism and ready for a return to normalcy. During the 1920s, as the public relaxed into a mood of acquiescence in business domination, the transient character of much of progressivism became apparent. The progressive movement had never succeeded in remedying the maldistribution of wealth, which was increasing even as its reforms were being passed. Now its very efforts to establish an apparatus for the effective regulation of business were constantly frustrated. The Federal Trade Commission, for example, far from preventing unfair practices as was intended, became an agency for business consolidation. The heroic efforts of the progressives to uproot the bosses and put government in the hands of the people also seem to have failed, though the progressive legislation remained on the books as a possible check to corrupt machines. The most durable aspect of progressivism seems to have been its social legislation. For even during the conservative 1920s, much of this legislation was extended, and in some states its enforcement was improved. Despite the transiency of many of its achievements, the heritage of the progressive movement cannot be considered small or unimportant. The progressives developed, for the first time on a large scale, a type of realistic journalism and social criticism that has become a permanent quality of American thinking. They gave renewed strength to the climate of opinion hostile of monopoly and suspicious of arbitrary aggregates of business power, which forced big business to operate circumspectly and even to exercise some self-restraint. The traditions of responsible government and forceful leadership, exemplified by men like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, established unforgettable high points in American statesmanship. Finally, the reforms of the progressive era established a basis and a precedent for further reforms to be passed when the need for them was felt. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal owed a heavy debt to its progressive forerunners, both for moral inspiration and for some of its administrative devices. The men and women of the progressive movement must be considered, in this regard, to be pioneers of the welfare state. This was not because they sought to foster big government for its own sake, but they were determined to remedy the most pressing and dangerous social ills of industrial society. In the attempt, they quickly learned that they could not achieve their ends without using the power of an administrative state. Moreover, they asserted, and they were the first in our history to do so with real practical success, the idea that government cannot be viewed merely as a cold and negative policing agency, but that it has a wide and pervasive responsibility for the welfare of its citizens and for the poor and powerless among them. For this, progressivism must be understood as a major episode in the history of the American conscience. So anyways, please rate, subscribe, and comment down below. And if you're on YouTube, please ring that bell notification so that you can know when I upload. And if you're on TikTok, please like and follow my videos. And once we get to 50 subscribers on YouTube and 40 followers on TikTok, I'll do something special, okay? So let's go do that. Yay! And please pay for something on either my eBay and or my card. Okay, bye!